1 block. That is the footprint of St. Louis Cemetery number 1. 1 block pressed against the French Quarter like a secret kept in plain sight. The heat arrives first, white, total, radiating off plaster that has baked since 1789. Then the smell, old stone, standing water, and something beneath both that resists naming. The tombs crowd the narrow aisles like witnesses who have agreed to say nothing. On one of them, thousands of X marks are scratched across 2 centuries of separate hands, each mark a request, none of them answered. At the far end of the central path, something moves. What do the dead agree to when they are placed here? There is a place in New Orleans where the dead do not go down. They go up, stacked into white plaster walls, sealed behind small rectangular doors that face the living like 1,000 closed eyes. The ground here cannot hold them. The city sits below sea level, and what goes into the earth comes back, pushed upward by water and pressure and something that has never been adequately named. So the builders of this city made a different arrangement. They built a city for the dead that mirrors the city for the living, streets between the tombs, addresses, hierarchies, a governing logic. 1 city block in the French Quarter, several hundred years of wait, more than 100,000 souls pressed into a space smaller than most suburban parking lots. On a hot morning, which in New Orleans is most mornings, the white plaster of the tombs throws back the heat like a second sun. The smell is old stone and standing water and something faintly botanical. Herbs or the memory of herbs. If you stand still long enough in the central alley, the silence between the tour groups is not empty. It has texture. Something moves through it that is not wind. And at the entrance to the oldest section, the most visited tomb in this cemetery, perhaps the most visited tomb in the American South, is covered in marks, thousands of them, scratched into the plaster by thousands of different hands over 2 centuries. X marks, drawn by people who wanted something and believed that asking here, in this way from whoever lay inside, was the most direct method available. The question this place raises is not whether the dead remain, it is whether they were ever permitted to leave. The tomb sits in the oldest section of St. Louis Cemetery number 1, the city's first official Catholic cemetery, established in 1789 on what was then the northern edge of the French Quarter. It is a modest structure by the standards of the cemetery's more elaborate society tombs. White plaster over brick, roughly 6 feet wide, marked with offerings that visitors leave and the groundskeepers periodically clear, and that return again before the week is out. Plastic beads, small bottles of rum, flowers in varying states of decay, handwritten notes folded and pressed into cracks in the mortar. And the marks, the X marks, scratched by fingernails and coins and keys, covering every inch of the lower half of the tomb's face like a second text written over the official one. The name on the tomb is Marie Laveau, or rather, a name. The tomb is officially designated as belonging to the Glapian family, and the question of whether Marie Laveau is actually interred here is one the city has never resolved and probably never will. What is not in dispute is what the marks mean, what the offerings mean, what the letters and the rum and the flowers mean. They mean that people still need something from her. They mean that whatever she was in life, and what she was is considerably more difficult to categorize than most official histories have attempted. The transaction between her and this city did not end with her death. Understanding what she was requires understanding the world she was born into. Marie Laveau was born in New Orleans around 1801, the exact date unrecorded, to a free woman of color named Marguerite Henry, and, by most accounts, a wealthy white Creole planter named Charles Laveau. The word planter does the same work here it always does in antebellum Louisiana. It describes a man whose prosperity was built entirely on enslaved labor and who occupied the apex of a racial and economic hierarchy so formally structured that it had developed its own legal subcategories, its own customs, its own language for the gradations of power and constraint it imposed on everyone below him. Marie Laveau occupied a particular stratum of that hierarchy. She was a free woman of color, gens de couleur libre, which meant she existed in a legal and social space that had no true equivalent elsewhere in the antebellum United States. Free people of color in New Orleans could own property. They could enter into contracts. They could, in certain circumstances, own enslaved people themselves, a fact the city's history holds without resolving. They could not vote, they could not hold office, they could not marry white citizens. They existed in a designated middle register, above the enslaved, below the white Creole establishment, and they were expected to remain there. The mechanism that governed much of their social existence, particularly for free women of color, was the plaçage system. The word derives from the French verb placer, to place. Under this arrangement, free women of color entered into long-term, socially recognized partnerships with white men of means, partnerships that were not legal marriages but that carried many of the practical features of marriage: shared households, financial support, acknowledged children, inheritance structures. These arrangements were often negotiated by the woman's mother at gatherings specifically organized for this purpose. They were, depending on how one chooses to examine them, a form of economic protection operating inside a system that offered women of color no other reliable access to security, or a form of institutionalized concubinage, dressed in social ritual serving the preferences of wealthy white men. The city has always been more comfortable with the first description. Marie Laveau's own domestic arrangements were complicated and remain partially obscured by the official record. She married a free man of color named Jacques Paris in 1819, a carpenter who had emigrated from Saint-Domingue. Jacques Paris disappeared from the historical record within a few years of the marriage. The official record does not explain how or why. Marie Laveau thereafter entered into a long partnership with a man named Christophe Dominique Duminy de Glapion, a white Creole of some means. They lived together on St. Anne Street for decades. They had children. The number varies by account, with some sources listing as many as 15, others as few as 7. One of those children, a daughter who shared her name and her vocation, would eventually become so intertwined with the mother's legend that the city stopped being able to tell them apart. This is not incidental to the story. It is the story. What Marie Laveau understood, with a precision that no one in her social position was supposed to possess, was information. She worked as a hairdresser, one of the few professions available to free women of color that brought them into direct, sustained, intimate contact with New Orleans' white Creole establishment. She entered their homes, she stood behind their chairs, she listened. The households of the city's attorneys, judges, and politicians opened their private rooms to her in a way they would not have opened them to any peer, because she was not categorized as a peer. She was the hairdresser, and the hairdresser heard everything. What she did with what she heard was not merely gossip, it was leverage. Contemporary accounts describe a woman who knew, in documented cases, the contents of legal proceedings before they were made public, who knew which prominent family had a secret it could not afford to have spoken aloud, who knew which official needed something that could not be obtained through official channels. She built a network of informants, primarily women of color employed in the households of the powerful, and she transformed that network into a form of currency that the official economy of New Orleans had no category for. She could not vote, she could not hold office, she had no title, no legal standing in the courts she influenced, no recognized authority of any kind. She was, by any reasonable measure, the most politically connected person in 19th century New Orleans. The first documented demonstration of what that connection could accomplish centers on a young man condemned to death. The specifics vary by account, but the structure of the story is consistent. A man of means approached Marie Laveau on behalf of a son who had been found guilty of a crime serious enough to warrant execution. She accepted the case. For 3 consecutive days, contemporary accounts describe her kneeling in prayer before the altar of St. Louis Cathedral, public, visible, entirely within the conventions of her Catholic faith, which she practiced with a sincerity that her enemies found inconvenient and her followers found essential. On the 3rd day, the young man's sentence was commuted. What happened next is the part of the story that the official record cannot comfortably contain. The young man's sentence was commuted. The father, according to contemporary accounts, had promised Marie Laveau something in return. The precise nature of that arrangement has not survived in any document, though the city carries the story that it involved property or influence or both. What matters structurally is what the transaction reveals. She operated in an economy of favors and information that ran entirely parallel to the official economy of the city, and she was better at it than anyone who held a title or a deed. She had no courtroom, she had no ballot. What she had was the ear of every household that mattered, and a reputation that by the 1840s had become something the city's powerful, found it more prudent to accommodate than to challenge. The yellow fever wards are the second documented chapter of that reputation, and they belong to a different order of courage entirely. Yellow fever arrived in New Orleans with a regularity that the city treated, after enough generations, as a condition of existence rather than a catastrophe. The way a city built on water learns to speak of flooding not as disaster but as season. The epidemic of 1853 killed an estimated 11,000 people in a single summer, in a city whose total population was barely 100,000. The city's physicians were overwhelmed. Its priests were, by a number of contemporary accounts, reluctant to enter the wards where the dying were concentrated. The risk of transmission was understood well enough to make heroism a calculation, not a reflex. Marie Laveau did not make the calculation. She walked into the wards. She administered what comfort was available. Water, presents, the last rites of a Catholic faith she practiced with the same seriousness she brought to the voodoo ceremonies she led at the edge of Lake Pontchartrain. She sat with the dying when the city's official clergy would not. She was not young when she did this. She was, by most estimates, in her 50s. She emerged from the epidemic without contracting the disease, a fact the city absorbed into her legend with the same ease it absorbed everything else about her, as evidence of protection, of power, of something that did not submit to ordinary categories of explanation. Whether that immunity was the result of prior exposure, as some historians have proposed, or of something else entirely, is a question the city has never resolved. The circumstances of her death are stranger still. In June of 1881, New Orleans newspapers reported that Marie Laveau had died at her home on St. Anne Street, aged approximately 80 years. The reports described her final hours in reasonable detail. Neighbors who visited, a peaceful end, a woman whose long life had come to its natural conclusion. The city mourned her in the way it mourns its legends, which is to say, it mourned her loudly and immediately began telling stories. The problem is that multiple credible witnesses reported seeing Marie Laveau in public after the date of her reported death. Not glimpses, not fleeting impressions in low light. Documented sightings, described to journalists and recorded in the press, of a woman matching her description, tall, composed, wearing the traditional tignon head wrap, moving through the French Quarter neighborhoods she had inhabited for 60 years. The rational explanation, offered by historians and accepted by many of them, is straightforward. There were two Marie Laveaus, the mother, who died in 1881, and the daughter, Marie Laveau II, who shared not only her name but her vocation, her appearance, and her territory. The daughter continued her mother's practice well into the latter half of the 19th century, and the city, which had always treated them as a single, continuous force, simply continued to do so after the mother's death. The daughter became the mother. The legend became seamless. Whether that explanation accounts for everything the witnesses described is a question the city has never resolved. At the tomb, in the years since, the reports have a different texture entirely. Those who have worked in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 long enough describe a particular quality of attention near the Glapian tomb in the early morning, before the tour groups arrive and the day reconstitutes itself into something manageable. A woman in a blue tignon seen between the tomb and the wall of the adjacent section, standing still in the manner of someone who is not waiting for anything because she already knows how it ends. The smell that accompanies the sighting is always described the same way. Herbs, and something warmer beneath the herbs, something that does not come from the stone. She does not approach, she does not speak, she is simply there, and then she is not. The rational explanation, residual impression, misidentification in uncertain light, the mind's tendency to populate charged spaces with the figures it expects, is available, and it accounts for something. Whether it accounts for all of it is a question only the tomb knows, and the tomb has said nothing on the subject that can be transcribed. What remains, regardless of interpretation, is the moral architecture of her story. The most politically powerful figure in 19th century New Orleans held no political power. She could not vote, could not hold office, could not enter into a legal marriage with the man she spent decades of her life beside. The power she exercised was entirely unofficial, conducted through channels the official city did not acknowledge and could not dismantle because it could not admit that they existed. She built it from a hairdresser's chair and a network of women who moved through the city's households like water through limestone, quietly, completely, finding every fissure. The X marks remain, New ones appear faster than the groundskeepers remove the old ones. People still come to the tomb with specific requests, written on paper, whispered into the plaster, scratched into the stone with whatever they have available. They come from all over the country and increasingly from other countries entirely. They come the way people have always come to places where power has been demonstrated, not because they are certain it will work, but because the record suggests it has. The cemetery holds this story the way it holds all its stories, without comment, without resolution, with the patience of a place that has been keeping things far longer than anyone now living has been asking questions. The city of New Orleans did not invent the above-ground burial system. It arrived at it through a process of failure that the official record describes with bureaucratic restraint and that the ground itself describes rather more vividly. In the early years of the colonial settlement, the dead were buried in the conventional European manner, in the earth, marked with wooden crosses that the climate consumed within a generation. The ground accepted them, then it returned them. The water table in New Orleans sits within a few feet of the surface across most of the original settlement, and the saturated soil behaves during periods of heavy rain and flooding in ways that challenge the assumptions of any society that expects its dead to remain where they are placed. Coffins rose. They surfaced in the streets after storms. They emerged from the earth in the middle of the night with a slow, relentless pressure that no amount of additional soil could permanently counteract. The city watched this happen. The city made a decision. If the earth would not keep the dead would be kept above the earth. The first official Catholic cemetery established within the city limits, St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, consecrated in 1789 on the northern edge of the French Quarter, was designed from its earliest years around the logic of vertical interment. The wall vaults that line the cemetery's perimeter are known locally as the oven vaults, and the name is not metaphorical. They are long, horizontal niches stacked in rows, each one roughly 7 feet deep and 2 feet high, sealed with a marble or plaster face when occupied, the seal inscribed with whatever the family could afford. A name, a date, sometimes only initials, sometimes nothing at all. From a distance, the rows of sealed rectangular doors read as a kind of architecture, orderly and considered. Up close, you notice that the seals are not uniform. Some are marble, carefully engraved. Some are rough plaster, the letters pressed in by hand. Some have no inscription that remains legible. The cemetery holds all of these with the same composure it holds everything else. The logic behind the system was economic before it was anything else, and the economics were not subtle. A society tomb, one of the large freestanding structures belonging to a mutual aid organization, a fraternal order, or a religious confraternity, provided burial space for its members as part of the membership arrangement. To be part of the right society was to be guaranteed a named resting place within a structure that would be maintained, tended, and visited. The societies that built the most prominent tombs in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 represented the city's established Creole families, its Catholic fraternal orders, its community organizations of free people of color. Membership in these societies required resources, annual dues, social standing, the kind of accumulated capital that takes generations to build and a single financial disaster to lose. For those outside that network, the wall vault was the alternative. A family could rent a vault for a fixed period, typically 1 year, though the arrangements varied, and inter their dead within it during that time. At the end of the rental period, if the family renewed and paid, the vault remained sealed. If they did not, the vault was opened. What happened when the vault was opened is the part of the system that the cemetery's official literature has traditionally described in the most measured possible language. The remains inside were removed. They were transferred, what could be gathered, what had not entirely returned to the constituent elements of a Louisiana summer, into a communal space beneath the floor of the vault itself, an ossuary that accumulated the commingled remains of every tenant who had preceded the current one in that particular niche. There was no individual grave marker for what went below. There was no record, in most cases, of whose remains joined whose. The wall vault above was then cleaned, resealed, and made available for the next tenant. The cemetery holds the remains of the city's poor this way, layered, commingled, unnamed beneath the floor of a rental unit. Consider what that means, not as a judgment of the people who administered the system. They were operating within the constraints of a city that was itself operating within the constraints of 19th century Catholic burial law, 19th century economics, and a death toll that during epidemic years overwhelmed every structure the city possessed. Consider what it means as a fact. The named dead and the unnamed dead of New Orleans occupy the same physical space, separated only by a stone floor and an economic transaction that the poorer family could not complete. The cemetery does not distinguish between them in any way visible from the outside. The wall looks the same regardless of what the accounting books recorded. The racial architecture of the cemetery operated alongside the economic architecture and cannot be understood apart from it. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 was consecrated as a Catholic cemetery, open in principle to all Catholic faithful regardless of race. In practice, the cemetery's social organization reflected the social organization of the city that surrounded it. Free people of color maintained their own society tombs within the cemetery. The St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 holds several of these structures, representing organizations that functioned as mutual aid networks for a community that was excluded from the white Creole fraternal orders, while also occupying a legal and social position entirely distinct from the enslaved population. The geography of the cemetery encoded these distinctions in plaster and marble, the way all cities encode their hierarchies in stone when they run out of other languages. What the official consecration policy did not address, and what the official record tends not to dwell on, is the question of the enslaved dead. The Catholic Church's position on the souls of the enslaved was nominally inclusive. What the cemetery's actual practice was during the decades when New Orleans held the largest urban enslaved population in the American South is a question the ground answers more directly than any document. The sounds from the oven vault section are the first ghost report that the cemetery's long-term workers tend to offer, and they offer it with the particular flatness of people who have given up expecting to be believed. The sound is described consistently across accounts spanning several decades, a low, rhythmic knocking from inside one of the sealed vaults, heard most often in the early morning before the cemetery opens to the public when the air is still and the tour groups have not yet arrived to fill the silence with their noise. The knocking does not continue if someone approaches the vault directly. It stops. It resumes after the person has moved away. Multiple cemetery workers, interviewed independently across years by journalists and researchers who have spent time documenting the site, describe the same sound from the same general section of the north wall. The rational explanation is available, and it is not without substance. The thermal expansion of limestone and old brick in the Louisiana heat produces sounds that can travel through the wall structure in irregular ways. Old mortar contracts at night and expands as the stone warms in the morning. A cemetery that has stood since 1789 contains materials that have been cycling through expansion and contraction for well over 2 centuries, and the sounds that process generates are not always predictable or easily located. A sound that seems to originate from inside a sealed vault may originate from 3 vaults down, or from the wall structure itself, traveling through the stone in ways that are acoustically disorienting. Whether that explanation accounts for the directionality the workers describe, the way the sound stops when someone stands directly in front of the vault from which it appears to come and resumes when that person steps away, is a question the cemetery has never resolved and shows no particular inclination to resolve. The cemetery keeps this, the way it keeps everything, not as a mystery requiring solution, as a condition of the place, as part of what the ground holds. The ghost reports from the wall vault section do not involve apparitions. They do not involve figures or forms or anything that can be photographed or described with visual specificity. They involve only the sound and the silence that follows it, and the particular quality of attention the section demands from anyone who stands in it, long enough to stop hearing only what they expected to hear. That quality of attention is its own form of testimony. The gap between what the official record says and what the ground contains is the central fact of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, and the yellow fever epidemics are where that gap becomes impossible to close. The epidemic of 1853 is the most documented. Estimates produced by contemporary physicians and later by historians working from death registers, hospital records, and municipal reports place the total mortality for that single summer somewhere between 11,000 and 12,000 people in New Orleans. The city's population at the time was approximately 100,000. 1 in every 8 or 9 residents died within a period of roughly 4 months. The official church burial records for St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 during that period account for a fraction of that number. The rest were processed through a system: cemeteries across the city, emergency interment sites, mass graves, and disposal methods that the official record describes in the most general possible language and then does not revisit. What the ground of this cemetery received during the epidemic years is not fully accounted for in any document that has survived. The Church's position, stated clearly in the records that do exist, was that Catholic burial rites required individual interment, individual record, individual consecration of the specific ground where the specific person was placed. The practice and the principle diverged during epidemic years in ways that the surviving documentation tends to obscure rather than illuminate. The gap between what was required and what was actually done in the summer of 1853, when bodies arrived at a rate that overwhelmed every structure the cemetery possessed, is a silence that the official record chose and has maintained. The cemetery absorbed what it was given. It does not distinguish in any way visible from the outside between the carefully recorded dead and the unrecorded ones. The ground holds them with identical composure. The second ghost layer documented within the cemetery belongs to this silence, and it presents differently from the sounds described near the oven vault section. What cemetery workers, tour guides with long tenure, and a small number of researchers who have spent sustained time in the site describe as a localized cold. Not a draft, not a movement of air, but a drop in ambient temperature near specific wall vaults in the eastern section of the cemetery. A drop that does not correspond to shade or to the vault's position relative to the sun. It occurs most often in the late morning, when the Louisiana heat has already made the stone warm to the touch. The cold is described as contact, not as the temperature of the surrounding air changing, but as the specific sensation of a surface that should not be cold being cold, a pressure against the hand or the arm that is thermal rather than physical. The rational explanations are available, and the cemetery's administrators have offered them consistently over the years. Limestone is a poor conductor of heat and retains moisture in ways that can produce localized temperature variation, particularly in structures that have been standing for 2 centuries and have developed internal irregularities in their composition. The differential between the interior of a sealed vault and the exterior air in a Louisiana summer is substantial, and microfractures in old mortar can produce localized cold spots at the seal line without any agency other than physics. These explanations are sound. They account for something. Whether they account for the specific sensation of sustained contact, the quality that those who have experienced it consistently describe as a tension, as something directed rather than ambient, is a question the cemetery has never resolved. What the institution built here was a hierarchy of the dead that mirrored, with architectural precision, every hierarchy the living city had constructed above ground. What it could not build was a container sufficient for the weight of what it had decided not to record. The silence it chose in the summer of 1853 did not dissipate. The cemetery holds it, the way it holds everything, without comment, without resolution, with the patience of a structure that has been keeping things far longer than anyone now living has been asking questions. There is a tomb in the older section of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 that receives almost no visitors. It is modest in a way that reads, in this particular cemetery, as a statement. The stone is plain, the lettering is simple. There are no offerings left at its base, no marks scratched into the plaster by hands seeking something from whoever lies within. The name on the tomb is Homer Plessy, and the city of New Orleans spent the better part of a century and a half treating that name as a fact it preferred not to examine too closely. Homer Plessy was a shoemaker, a French-speaking Creole of color, a man who by the racial classifications of Louisiana in 1892 was considered under the law to be black, a designation he did not dispute and which was, in any case, beside the point of what he agreed to do on June 7th of that year, when he purchased a first-class ticket on the East Louisiana Railroad and took a seat in a car designated for white passengers. He was arrested. He had agreed to be arrested. He was part of a coordinated legal challenge organized by a citizens' committee in New Orleans that had raised money specifically to contest Louisiana's Separate Car Act of 1890, which mandated racially segregated railway cars. The challenge moved through the courts and arrived before the United States Supreme Court in 1896, where it was decided against him by a vote of 7-1. The resulting opinion, Plessy versus Ferguson, established the doctrine of separate but equal as the constitutional law of the United States, and that doctrine governed American public life for the next 58 years. Homer Plessy died in 1925. He is buried here. The state of Louisiana did not pardon him until 2022, 130 years after his arrest for sitting in a railway car. The pardon was granted by the Louisiana Board of Pardons following an application submitted by the descendants of Homer Plessy and of John Howard Ferguson, the judge who originally ruled against him, descendants who had found each other and decided together that the pardon was overdue. The official ceremony was quiet. The tomb received no particular decoration afterward. The city noted the event in the press and moved on. The cemetery keeps his name without ceremony. It always has. Across the cemetery, in the section given over to the larger society tombs, stands a structure of an entirely different scale. The tomb maintained by the Italian Mutual Benevolent Society, an organization founded in the mid-19th century to serve New Orleans' substantial and frequently overlooked Italian immigrant community. The structure is one of the largest in the cemetery, a multi-tiered monument in white plaster and marble that holds, by the organization's own historical estimates, the remains of more than 2,000 individuals interred across several generations of immigrant New Orleanians who could not afford private burial plots and depended on the society's collective tomb as their only guaranteed resting place. The sounds near this tomb are not what draw the attention of those who have spent time here after hours, in the particular quiet that descends on the cemetery between the last tour group's departure and the close of the gates. What draws attention is the figure. Those who have worked the cemetery long enough describe a figure standing at the entrance arch of the society tomb's enclosure. A man, by all accounts, in clothing that does not correspond to any contemporary style, standing with his back to the central alley, facing the tomb's sealed doors. He does not move when addressed. He does not turn. When the observer moves to a position that would place him within the figure's peripheral vision, the figure is no longer there. The figure at the entrance of the Italian Mutual Benevolent Society tomb enclosure is not the haunting that those who have spent the most time here find the most difficult to account for. It is the names inside. The society tomb holds individual plaques mounted in rows along the interior walls of the structure's antechamber, each one bearing the name and dates of a member or a member's family interred within. Many of these plaques are from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the peak years of Italian immigration into New Orleans, when Sicilian and Southern Italian families arrived by the thousands and settled in the neighborhoods immediately adjacent to the French Quarter, in numbers large enough to reshape the city's food, its music, and its social organization. They came because New Orleans was a port city that spoke to port city sensibilities, and because the labor market was open in ways that other American cities with more rigid racial and ethnic hierarchies were not. They built their community institutions, their churches, their mutual aid societies, their shared burial arrangements, with the pragmatic speed of people who understood that the city would not build those institutions for them. The children's names are on the interior walls as well. There are many of them concentrated in the earlier decades of the record, the 1880s and 90s, the years when childhood mortality rates in New Orleans were among the highest in the country, when yellow fever and cholera and the ordinary accumulation of diseases that the city's swampy climate made endemic carried children away at a rate that the community absorbed with a grief that has no adequate documentation. The names are small, the dates are close together. A child born in 1884 and dead in 1887, a child born and dead in the same year, with only a first name recorded and no surname, as if the recording clerk could not bring himself to finish the entry. The cemetery holds these names the way it holds everything, without editorial comment, without softening. Multiple independent witnesses, including tour guides with more than a decade of experience leading groups through the cemetery maintenance workers who have spent years in daily proximity to the structure, and a small number of researchers who have documented the site in sustained detail, describe a sound near the society tomb that does not correspond to any identified source. It is heard most often in the afternoon when the sun is at its highest angle and the stone has reached its maximum temperature. The sound is laughter. Brief, high, the laughter of a child who has heard something that strikes them as genuinely funny, not performed, not extended. It stops before anyone can locate its direction. It does not repeat in the same session. Those who have heard it more than once describe it as identical across separate occasions, the same pitch, the same brief duration, the same quality of unself-conscious amusement. The rational explanation, acoustic reflection in a stone enclosure of this particular shape, sounds from outside the cemetery wall carried and modified by the geometry of the structure, is available. The cemetery sits in a residential and commercial neighborhood, and the sounds of children playing in nearby streets are not unusual. Whether sound carries and transforms in the specific way the witnesses describe, arriving as it does from inside a sealed enclosure rather than from over a wall, is a question the record does not resolve. The handprint appeared on a vault door in the Society Tomb's eastern interior wall in the spring of 2011, according to 3 separate accounts from workers who cleaned that section of the tomb in the weeks before and after it was observed. The vault it appeared on had been sealed since 1943. When the last member of the family whose name appears on the plaque was interred, and the plaque was closed with no subsequent additions. The handprint was small, the size of a child's hand, palm and 4 fingers, the thumb angled outward, pressed in what appeared to be condensation on the marble face of the sealed plaque. The marble was dry when the worker who first observed it arrived at the section. The print did not transfer to any cloth used to examine it. It was present for approximately 3 days before it was no longer visible. No explanation was offered by the cemetery's administration. The record does not indicate that one was formally sought. The grief-based haunting that belongs most completely to this cemetery, the one that carries no threat and no dramatic gesture, centers on a figure observed in the narrow passage between the Society tomb enclosure and the adjacent wall of private family tombs. A passage approximately 4 feet wide, running north to south, that receives almost no direct light even at midday because the structures on either side are tall enough to block the sun at any angle the Louisiana sky provides. In this passage, multiple witnesses across several decades describe seeing a woman standing with her back against one wall and her face turned toward the tomb enclosure, her arms held in front of her in the position of someone who is holding something that is no longer there. She does not move. She does not look at the person who observes her. She stands in the particular stillness of someone engaged in an internal task so consuming that the external world has ceased to register. When the observer moves toward her, she is not there. She leaves no evidence of having been there. She is simply a presence in a passage between 2 walls, holding something absent, and she has been seen in that position, in that passage, by people who did not know each other and did not know of each other's accounts, for as long as the cemetery has had people who spend enough time in it to notice. This cemetery sits 2 blocks from the Royal Street address of the house that Madame Delphine Lalaurie occupied from approximately 1831 until April 10th of 1834, when the fire that began in her kitchen brought the city to her door, and what the city found inside prompted a mob to pursue her carriage out of New Orleans entirely. The Lalaurie House, now an address on Royal Street that the city's tour industry has made among the most visited in the French Quarter, lies close enough to this cemetery that whatever weight those events placed on that particular geography has not dissipated with the intervening distance. The city's hauntings do not distribute themselves evenly across its geography. They concentrate in the places where the pressure of what happened was greatest, and they cluster the way trauma clusters in any closed system, in proximity, in layers, each one compounding the one beneath it. The cemetery keeps all of this without hierarchy. The X marks on Laveau's tomb, the unnamed remains beneath the ossuary floor, Plessy's modest stone, the children's names, the woman in the passage who holds something absent. The cemetery holds them at the same temperature, in the same white light, under the same Louisiana sky. What this place contains is not a collection of isolated events. It is a single continuous pressure, accumulated over more than 2 centuries in one city block. The final accounting is not in any document the city has produced. It is in the ground. Before the tour groups arrive, before the gates open to the day's first visitors, there is an hour in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 that belongs to no one living. The light at that hour comes in at a low angle, yellow and not yet white, and it moves across the plaster faces of the tombs in a way that makes the surfaces appear to breathe, the shadows in the carved letters deepening and then retreating as the light shifts, names appearing and then retreating back into the stone as if the cemetery is deciding, moment by moment, what it is willing to show. The sound at that hour is the sound the city makes when it does not know anyone is listening. Distant traffic, a single bell from a church several blocks away, and beneath those sounds, if you stand still long enough in the central alley, the particular silence of a place that has been accumulating weight for more than 2 centuries and has not finished yet. The smell is warm stone and standing moisture, and something older that has no name in any language the living use for ordinary things. This is the hour when the figure is most often seen. The estimates of how many people are interred within the boundary walls of St. Louis Cemetery Number 1 vary by source and method, but the lower estimates begin at approximately 100,000 individuals. And some researchers who have attempted to account for the epidemic years, the displaced ossuary remains, and the decades before systematic record-keeping was reliably enforced place the total considerably higher. 1 city block. The mathematics of that 100,000 people compressed into a space that a person of average pace can walk across in under 3 minutes is not a number that resolves into something manageable when you stand inside the space and attempt to hold it. The ground does not feel like ground. It feels like something else entirely, like a surface that is performing the function of ground while engaged in a different project entirely underneath. The figure has been described in consistent terms across accounts spanning at least 5 decades, drawn from cemetery workers, tour guides with long tenure, and visitors who had no prior knowledge of the existing accounts and who reported what they observed independently. The figure is seen in the central alley, the main corridor that runs from the cemetery's entrance toward the rear wall, moving at an unhurried pace in the direction of the older section, where the Glappian family tomb sits at the end of its row with its worn plaster and its accumulated offerings and its thousands of scratched X marks. The figure does not react to being addressed. It does not alter its pace when observed. It moves with the particular quality of attention of someone who knows exactly where they are going and is not concerned with arriving quickly because arrival is not the point. The figure reaches a certain position in the alley, level with the wall vault section, and is no longer there. No threat, no performance, simply movement, and then the absence of movement, and the alley exactly as it was before. The cemetery has held Laveau's tomb since 1881, or since the question of where she is actually interred became unanswerable, which amounts to the same thing in terms of what the stone has accumulated in the years since. It has held the oven vaults and their unnamed floors. It has held the gap between what the church's records say arrived during the epidemic summers and what the ground's capacity suggests actually came. It has held Homer Plessy's modest stone, unremarked upon for a century and a half, pardoned in 2022 for sitting in a railway car, the pardon arriving 130 years after the arrest and making no visible change to the quiet around the grave. It has held the society tomb with its thousands of immigrant names and its children's plaques and its sealed vault marked by a handprint that appeared in the spring of 2011 and remained for 3 days before it did not. It has held the woman in the narrow passage between the walls, who stands with her arms in the position of someone holding something absent, and does not look at you and is not there when you move toward her. This is what the cemetery does. It holds. The city of New Orleans built its oldest neighborhoods on the logic that what is placed in the ground stays where it is placed. The ground refused that logic within the first years of the settlement, and the city responded by building upward, stacking its dead and white plaster above the waterline, sealing them in horizontal niches, pressing them into the walls that now line every path through this space. What the city did not account for in any of its architectural solutions was the question of what happens to the weight of what is kept, not the physical weight. The city has always understood physical weight and managed it with engineering. The other weight, the weight of what was recorded and what was not recorded, the weight of what was named and what was left unnamed beneath an ossuary floor, the weight of a doctrine whose legal consequences lasted 58 years, buried in a modest stone that the state took 130 years to address. The weight of a woman whose power was total and whose authority was officially non-existent. The sealed doors that line the cemetery's perimeter walls are the oven vaults, now understood for what they are. Not architecture for architecture's sake, but a solution to a problem the earth created when it refused to keep what was given to it. The names worn off the marble are the names of people for whom the rental payments stopped, and the vaults were opened, and the remains were moved to a place below the floor that has no individual marker. The figure seen between the rows in the early morning light has a description that matches no single person the cemetery's records identify. It moves, it does not arrive. It has been moving, by available account, for at least 5 decades in the same alley toward the same section, disappearing at the same point in the corridor. Whether that figure is the residue of someone who lived here in the full sense, who moved through the city, navigated its hierarchies, built something from nothing within its constraints, and left something of themselves in the specific geography they inhabited, or whether it is something else, something that the available language for these phenomena does not yet have the precision to name, is a question the cemetery keeps without answering. It has kept everything else. The central question this place poses is not whether the dead remain. The evidence on that point is distributed across 2 centuries of independent accounts and has not been explained away by any of the rational alternatives the city has offered, though those alternatives are real and should not be dismissed. The question the cemetery actually poses, standing in the early light in the central alley with the stone warming around you and the silence doing what the silence here always does, is something quieter and more difficult. It is this: if a city builds itself on top of its dead, seals them above the waterline to keep them from rising, records some of their names and loses others beneath the floor, and then walks across that ground every day for 2 centuries without fully accounting for what it is walking on, what exactly does it owe the ground it stands on, and has it paid?